In this video, I'll be explaining the basic use of figured bass to represent inversions. Specifically, I'll be looking at 5/3, 6/3 and 6/4. It's very important that you've either watched part 5 of this series on chords, where I discuss inversions before watching this video, or you already know how to label and identify chords using the letters A, B or C, such as 1C, 5A or 2B. You'll also need to be comfortable with intervals, as these form the basis of figured bass. Figured bass is a system of representing chords and their inversions instead of the combination of Roman numerals and letters, such as 1B for this chord in C major, that I demonstrated in part 5 of this series of videos on chords. The Roman numeral details the chord number, in this case chord 1, whereas the letter shows the inversion, in this case first inversion, represented by the letter B. I'm only going to concentrate on the basics in this video because figured bass can get quite complex, but what I cover is an alternative and acceptable way of introducing figured bass into your music work by using figured bass to represent inversions. If you're studying for a music theory exam, it is often an essential part of study when looking at a cadence called the cadential 6/4-5-3. More of that in my videos about cadences. Let's start by having a look at chord 1A of C major. We can see that it is made up of the notes C, E and G. The A of 1A refers to the fact that the chord is in root position. Instead of using the letter A to show the chord is in root position, we can replace it with 5/3. Why 5/3? Well, because the notes in the chord are a third and a fifth above the root. Musicians might even refer to it as a 5/3 chord. The important thing to remember is that 5/3 is just another way of saying root position. So instead of writing 1A, we can write 1-5-3. Here's chord 1B of C major. As you'll know, because the E, the third of the chord, is in the bass, this means the chord is in first inversion, represented by the letter B. If we decide to use figured bass, we use the numbers 6/3. Now this is where it can get a little confusing. Let me explain. If we look back at chord 1A or 1-5-3, we know that the root is the C, the third is the E, and the fifth is the G. I'll copy these colours across to 1B or 1-6-3 so we can clearly see which note is which. Some students get confused between the numbers 6/3 of the figured bass and the numbers of the chord notes. The fifth of chord 1 in C major will always be the note G, the third will always be the note E, and the root will always be the note C. The 3 of 6/3 is referring to the G being a third above the bass note, whereas the 6 is referring to the C, which is a sixth above the bass note. The figured bass numbers are derived from the intervals above the bass note and not their position in the chord. Confused? Don't be. It's just a matter of getting used to another way of describing a chord. We'll have a look at another chord in a moment, but the important thing to remember is that first inversion of chord 1 can be written as 1-6-3. Finally, here's chord 1C of C major. Remember, this is chord 1C because the G, the fifth note of the chord, which I've highlighted blue, is in the bass. The C, highlighted red, is still the root, and the E, highlighted pink, is still the third. If we decide to use figured bass, we use 6/4. That's because the notes above the bass are a fourth, the C, and a sixth, the E, above the bass note. So we could refer to this as chord 1-6-4. So in a nutshell, 5/3 represents root position, 6/3 represents first inversion, whereas 6/4 represents second inversion. So by combining a Roman numeral with figured bass, you could express any basic chord, such as chord 2 in first inversion, or chord 4 in root position, and so on. Just a word of warning. Here's chord 1B or 1-6-3 from C major again. I mentioned earlier that it is called 6/3 due to the placement of the G, a third above the E, and the C, a sixth above the E. This time, let's move the G so it's an octave higher. It's still a first inversion of chord 1 as the E is in the bass, and it is still referred to as 1-6-3, even though the intervals are now a sixth between the E and the C, and a tenth between the E and the G. I know I said earlier that figured bass is based on the intervals above the bass note, but only in its simplest form. It doesn't matter which way around the notes are placed above the bass. Because it is first inversion, it will always be referred to as 6-3 and not 10-6 or any other possible interval arrangement. So this is 1-6-3, as is this. Another E has been added, as is this. An extra C and a G have been added. With the E in the bass and the notes C, E and G, this will always be 1-6-3 from C major. The same is true for 5-3 and 6-4. It doesn't matter how the chord notes are laid out, root position is always 5-3 and second inversion is always 6-4. And as I've just shown, first inversion is always 6-3. Before we end, it's just worth pointing out that although we're using 5-3, 6-3 and 6-4, which you will find in music which uses figured bass, as we're still showing the Roman numeral, this makes it not quite true figured bass. I mentioned earlier that figured bass can get quite complex. Well, we're just dipping our toes into figured bass. If we were to look at some music which uses figured bass, you'll see that the Roman numeral isn't used at all. As I've mentioned, this is just a small step into using figured bass to represent inversions, and this video is designed to be a helpful introduction to. It is worth knowing about these basics, particularly when it comes to that cadential 6-4-5-3, which I mentioned earlier. I do hope that this short video has been useful to you. Thanks for watching.